All right, welcome everybody. This will be quick, maybe 25 minutes. So we have Dan Kottke, a early Apple employee. He's actually been at VCF West a couple times. He actually at VCF East maybe 10 years ago, I think. And Ron Wayne, another early Apple employee. So Dan will be interviewing Ron. And we may not have time for questions, but we'll see how it goes. All right, so it's sort of like an ad hoc talk that we inserted here. So without further ado, Dan, if you're ready, and Ron, if you're ready.
In a second.
All right. All right. You can take it away when you're ready, Dan.
All right, and just remember, wave a piece of paper for my 5-minute warning. Did you hear that, Jeff? All right. Well, this was not pre-scheduled because I wasn't completely sure Ron was going to make it. Ron just had his 90th birthday, and
It took me 90 years to do it.
that's right, it took 90 years. And because I've been making Apple I replicas in recent years, and I hadn't shipped one yet because I keep finding other improvements that I want to add. But it was Ron's 90th birthday, and his assistant Charles got in touch with me and said, well, we should do something for Ron for his birthday, and he'd like an Apple I replica, I suppose. So that was the first one I shipped. I put it all together and sent it to Ron. And it got damaged in shipment. I didn't pack it well enough, but they managed to get it running.
Yes.
And and since Ron was willing to make the trip here, and Alex gave us a slot. This was going to be an empty half hour. Actually, it was going to be an hour, but then he had to rearrange it. But I just thought not to miss this opportunity to have Ron here, and I can tell you a few things because, all right, so here's the bio. Let me think. Steve Jobs brought me to your house in June of '76. And the partnership agreement for the founding of Apple, which you wrote, was probably in April. Was that the April 1st?
I believe so.
It was.
Yeah, it was April 1st, 1976.
April Fool's Day is that he likes that idea. It's like, oh yeah, we're going to found a major corporation and let's do it on April Fool's Day. So it was the founding contract partnership, not a corporation. Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak, and Ron Wayne. And because Woz had a full-time job at Hewlett-Packard and was not even an entrepreneur wannabe, and Steve Jobs was 100% entrepreneur wannabe, but didn't have any experience, and really those guys didn't know what they were doing, except that they had a circuit board. So Ron was the critical third leg in the founding of Apple, and he can tell us a story, but here's what he contributed. The partnership agreement, which was essential. Neither Jobs nor Woz had any clue how to write a partnership agreement. I'm not sure how you knew how to write a partnership agreement.
Well, let's say 20 years of experience. I had written a number of contracts of the kind. But it was quite a surprise to Wozniak. He could have knocked his eyes off with a stick when he saw me sit down at the typewriter and type a 3-page agreement.
Wow.
In formalese.
And we might add at this point, what was the point in time where you sold that contract? It was much, much later.
I'm sorry?
Didn't you sell that contract?
I'm sorry you brought that up.
No, okay, never mind.
No, I'll tell you the story. It was about 15 years later. Nothing had been happening with Apple. And I saw an ad for people who were buying signatures of famous people. Jobs was famous by that time, and I wound up selling the contract for $500. I think it was a few years later, and that contract sold at auction for $1.3 million.
Right.
I was, well, shall we say, slightly aggrieved at my own foolishness.
But what's the theme? Well, you know, who knew? So the question is, Apple could have easily gone out of business at the end of the 90s. Easily. And in which case, nobody would have been buying that contract.
No, but Jobs was a very stubborn guy.
Right.
And he did a magnificent job driving that enterprise into what it was. Everyone knows that when he got in conflict with the board of directors and finally left the company, the whole place went absolutely down, 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 until he came back, and then it recovered.
Yeah.
There's no question that Jobs was the driving force behind that enterprise.
And anyway, back to the contributions. So you are the person who came up with the famous Newton logo.
Right.
And Steve must have said, "Ron, we need a logo."
Yes,
Right?
that was so. And I was being whimsical. I caught my whimsy from Wozniak, who was an extremely sort of guy who flipped around to everything. And I decided on an analogy using Newton with the image of the apple in the tree and the legend and all the rest. And I just had a ball. I think I spent 2 days doing it in pen and ink. And, excuse me. Turn this off, will you please? At any rate, that was how that logo happened. I knew it was not a 20th century logo. It was a 19th century logo. But I thought that an analogy of what was going on would be appropriate. And apparently Jobs liked to be, he had a huge curtain-like thing made up with that for their first marketing display. So apparently it was good for that moment in time, which is all that it needed to be. But it was fun.
And that is the logo that's on the cover of the Apple manual, which you also authored.
Yes, I did.
And you also drew the schematic, which is kind of important.
Okay. Well, I had 20 years experience before I got together with these guys. I was in my 40s, those kids were in their 20s. And
Right.
they were whirlwinds. It was like having a tiger by the tail. And a thoroughly pleasurable experience.
So a little more background. I became friends with Steve. We were freshmen at Reed College, and Steve dropped out the first month, got all his tuition back, and then went to the dean and said, "You know, I can't afford to be here, but I really like this environment. Can I audit classes? Can I stay? Can I stay and be a student and not get grades?" And he charmed the dean. And so Steve was at Reed for the full first year. And in fact, the summer after our first year, I came out to California, and Steve and I went up to the All One Farm in Oregon and were put in charge of the apple harvest. And because Steve he was interested in diet and metabolism, as was I. Steve and I partly became friends because we were both interested in Zen macrobiotics. And then Steve found this fruitarian diet book, which was actually very interesting. So we were fasting on apples. That's really the origin story of the name Apple. Anyway, that was 75. In fall of 75, Steve left at the end of the semester and didn't come back. And by January, he had a job at Atari, which was booming, and that's where Ron worked. And when did you start at Atari?
I started at Atari a couple of years earlier, and Jobs was marketing, actually. I don't think he was a formal employee at Atari.
I think he was part-time.
Marketing games that Wozniak had designed to Nolan Bushnell, which is what brought him in contact with me, because as chief draftsman and product development engineer, every new game that came out came across my desk because I had to design and document the enclosures. So I was doing that, and he brought in quite a number of games, and we became quite chummy over the years. He, for some reason or other, because I was his senior and had 20 years experience in the business, he regarded me as a kind of mentor, which I was very honored, and I did my best to fill the role.
And meanwhile, so that same summer, Steve would bring, when I was visiting him in California, he would bring me over to Atari at night. And Al Alcorn tells the story that Steve was a little bit disruptive and didn't want, Al was the head of engineering. Al didn't want Steve there during the day. And so I never knew what I didn't have a technical knowledge, and so I didn't know what Steve was working on, but he was maybe troubleshooting boards or not just testing them, but...
No, he was a master technician.
Yeah. And so, but he would bring me over there in the nighttime and turn me loose. The giant production floor was bigger than this room, and it was filled with arcade games. And so I was just playing games at night. And so that was 1975. Now, when did Pong come out? Like 73?
Oh, earlier. Yeah, it was before I went to work for Atari.
I think it was around 73.
That sounds reasonable.
But that was only 2 years before. So Atari, I think, was one of the earliest huge successful companies in America.
Yes.
Sold for $28 million to Warner.
Continued to rocket under the direction of Atari. Yeah, and Nolan Bushnell was quite a character.
Yes, I didn't meet Nolan until later, but anyway, so that's how Ron knew Steve Jobs.
Yes.
And then so now we're talking about the spring of '76. Is when Nolan Bushnell needed another game and offered a bounty if Steve Jobs, and Steve Jobs is like, oh, I know this guy Woz, we'll do a new game for you. Did you know about that deal?
No.
Anyway, that's a story Woz tells. And Woz is just a creative genius and loves to do things, whether he's paid or not. He was a full-time engineer at Hewlett-Packard working on the calculators. And Hewlett-Packard was the world leader in calculators. It was the first scientific calculator. You were probably interested in that.
Only vaguely peripherally. That close contact with the technology itself was not my responsibility or really my primary interest. My primary interest actually was to go in there and help the kids. I wasn't hired in or offered a salary or anything. Matter of fact, I didn't get a penny out of it until after the project, my end of the project was over, and I left, and then Jobs sent me a check for $800. And then when the corporation was founded, the attorneys sent me a letter saying if I will absolve myself of all connection whatsoever with Apple, I could have the $1,500 check they included. That was my compensation. It was all unexpected, and I regarded it as found money.
Well, so that would have been Mike Markkula, because neither Jobs nor Woz. Yeah. I mean, Woz is a very generous guy, but he's not like a business-oriented guy.
Right.
And Markkula was already retired at age 30 from Intel when he came across the two Steves. And so he became the third founder of Apple Corporation.
I actually believe that Jobs or Wozniak would have independently been very, very successful. There was no question. But they were perfect foils for each other. Jobs was focused on business. And when he had a focus, the last place you wanted to be was between him and it, or you'd wind up with footprints on your forehead.
Good line.
Jobs was whimsical. He did everything he did and everything he does today for the pure fun of doing it. And that was the relationship. They were, as I say, opposites and foils for each other.
Well, Woz was whimsical too. He's a famous joker. Did he ever play a joke on you?
No, for some reason we just got along well, and that was it. But he never picked on me or chose me as a target for any of his fun.
You know how Jobs and Woz initially partnered? Do you know the graduation story from
The
Homestead
graduation?
High?
No, I do not.
You don't know that story?
No.
It's an aside, but it's funny. So Jobs and Woz knew each other. Really, Bill Fernandez introduced them. You might not have known Bill.
No.
But anyway, Woz was 4 years older, and so they wouldn't have known each other in high school. But Bill Fernandez introduced them. And in 1971 was the famous Blue Box article of Esquire magazine talking about the blue boxes and hacking the phone network. And Woz found that magazine and called up Steve and said, "Steve, we gotta find out how to do this." As a prank. The whole thing was just a prank. And it turned out that Captain Crunch was at Berkeley where Woz was taking classes. So it was not a big stretch for them to drive up to Berkeley and go ask around and find Captain Crunch. And then once they found Crunch, Woz is like pumping him for the details of how the Blue Box scheme works. And within 1 week, Woz has got his prototype. And the original Blue Boxes were analog, which was tedious because the DTMF, that's how it worked. And DTMF requires phase-locked loops, and you need a phase-locked loop for each of the 8 frequencies. So it's a tedious thing to build, but that's what Crunch was doing. And Woz does a digital version, which, anyway. Let's see.
If I may, perhaps people would like to know the moment that Apple was born.
Yes, let's hear that.
Okay. Well, Jobs one day came into my office and said he and Wozniak, whom I hadn't met yet, were going to form a company, except that Jobs was having a problem with Woz because Woz was extremely parental about all the circuits that he had developed. And he wanted to reserve the right to use those circuits in other applications. And Jobs, of course, had gone straight up the wall, turn left, because as far as he was concerned, any circuit designs were proprietary to the new company. But Jobs, though he had many, many talents, was never much of a diplomat. You know what a diplomat is. That's a guy that can tell you to go to hell in a way that makes you look forward to the trip. Anyway, that was not his skill. And he comes to me and says, "Hey, can you talk to Woz and get him to understand the concept of proprietorship?" And I said, "Well, fine, bring him over to the apartment, and we'll sit down, we'll chat. I'm sure I can get him to understand." And it was true. It was about a 20-minute conversation with Woz, and finally he said, "Okay, now I understand. Yes, I agree. I'll yield to the proprietorship thing." That was at the moment at which Jobs literally jumped up and said, "That's it. We're going to form a company." And Jobs and Woz would have 45%, and I was to have 10% as the tiebreaker in the event of any difficulties. He thought I would come down on the side of reason, and that's how that all worked out. That was when I typed up the agreement between us.
It was that March of 76, you think?
Yep.
So April 1st was the day you signed the contract. So
Yes.
yeah, so it was late March. I didn't hear about it. Well, Steve never came back to read, but I would call him once a month, more or less. Anyway, okay, before we move on, back to the logo, where did Steve Jobs suggest that? Not the logo, the text. Isaac Newton,
That was
mind.
entirely mine.
a mind forever journeying.
A mind forever voyaging through
strange seas of thought alone.
It was the last line of a Wordsworth poem.
Oh, right, Wordsworth. And Steve Jobs obviously liked it. Woz wouldn't have really cared, probably.
But it worked.
That was a phenomenal creation, Ron.
Thank you, sir.
You're a very talented graphic artist.
I know, but I can't help myself.
Uh-oh, 5 minutes. Oh, my gosh. Well, so now we have to wrap up. Well, at least we got the creation of Apple. You know what? There's another half-hour slot later today. We could do a part 2, right? I think so, Jeff. Oh, okay. All right. Well, so listing the contributions you made. So you drew the schematic, you wrote the manual, you designed the logo, you wrote the partnership agreement, and you
Just
also
generally provided assistance as it was needed, based upon the experience I'd had for the previous 20 years.
And who, I don't know what else would have happened, because Woz was not even an entrepreneur. Steve Jobs would have found someone else. Now, did you know Jerry Manick?
No, I did not.
Jobs knew him through Atari, and Jerry Manick, who designed the Apple II case, that's a year later, but Jerry did such a great job also. But he was just another employee. I think he came to Steve Jobs through Atari.
Yeah. Well, that case was an interesting thing because Jobs had come to me earlier and said, would I design the case for the Apple II? But he failed to tell me that he had already acquired $25 million to start the corporation. So I thought that these kids still didn't have 2 nickels between them, and I designed a product that required no tooling, an extremely inexpensive case to build. It was horizontal instead of the usual computer tower that has become standard throughout the industry, and an integral keyboard, and I actually had a timbre door on the keyboard, which never happened. Right. But at any rate, he paid me $1,500 for the design. I was a little disappointed that he didn't use it, but that's here and there. Good ideas generally take generations to happen. At any rate, there's a question over here.
Maybe not. All right, in our few minutes. Wait, before we move on, well, we're wrapping up, but Alan Alcorn confirms that people complained about Steve not showering often enough. That's a popular story, and I'm the one who traveled around India with him. And I stayed in his bedroom at his parents' house. Were you ever offended by Steve's body odor? No, probably not.
I'm familiar with the story, yes.
I say no. I never would have said that at all, but I just thought I'd ask.
No.
And let's see, I had one other. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention was the first time I met you, Steve brought me to your house. Mm-hmm. And that would have been in June of '76. Okay?
Right.
Because I didn't meet you in '75. And I was so impressed. You were making and selling clock kits made out of cardboard, die-cut cardboard gears. And what was the selling price? $30?
I don't remember. It was too long ago.
So you did the design of the die cuts, and then you paid to have some, because there were no laser cutters.
No,
in those
it
days.
never went into production.
Really?
Yeah, there were a number of things. There was a 3-bar scale that I put together, and a self-northing sundial, and a few other things.
You are a prolific inventor, Ron.
Fun stuff.
Does any one of those cardboard
Never
clocks?
happened. I still have.
I remember seeing them in plastic bags.
Nope, it never happened. It never became a product.
Well, you had a prototype anyway.
Yeah.
You never got to know Jeff Raskin, because
I don't believe so.
Jeff did a very similar thing. While he was at Apple, he created a thing called blocks that was die-cut sheets of cardboard that you could fold, and they would interlock to make 1-foot cubicle blocks, and they would nest together. And he was building cubicles at early Apple out of these blocks. And the people in documentation had them. It was like bunkers, because Henry Miller hadn't been invented yet. So people were building their cubicles out of Jeff's block. He called them blocks. And then it was considered a fire hazard, so they all had to go. Can't have piles of cardboard in the office. All right, 2 minutes. So, well, here's how I would like to wrap up your story. Is when I looked up your entry on Wikipedia the other day, I liked the phrase when you were describing why it was too much risk because it wasn't $25 million, it was $25,000 purchase order from the Byte Shop. That's what launched Apple. Right. That was a lot of money back then. And as a partnership, you were liable for so on the basis of the $25,000 purchase order from Paul Terrell, Steve Jobs got a line of credit at Kirolf Electronics. I think it was an electronics house to pay for all the chips. And he bought $15,000 worth of chips. And you would have been, with 30 days credit, that was the deal. 30 days credit of this huge amount of money to buy the ICs for the batch of Apple Ones that Paul Terrell ordered. And you were completely correct in realizing that they would have come after you, because neither Woz nor Jobs had any asset.
None.
None.
I had a house and a car and a bank account and a perfect target in the event that everything blew up.
Which it could well have.
It could have.
Could well have.
And that became the 5th or the 6th significant reason for me to ease my way out. There were never any disputes, never any arguments, and they understood that I was off interested in other things anyway, so I said just drifted away. My primary interest at that time in the back of my head was slot machines. And I spent
That's another half-hour
years
discussion.
doing that.
Okay, so anyway, so to wrap this story up, I had never known until I read the Wikipedia that one of the factors you considered was that the Byte Shop, which had produced the purchase order, had a bit of a reputation for not paying their bills on time. And it was a deadline of 30 days to pay for all these parts. And I thought, well, Ron, I would completely agree with your decision. So here's the quote. Here's the quote from Wikipedia. It says, in the words of Ron Wayne, I made the best decision I could based on the information available at the time. Mm-hmm. I just like that quote. All right, so we're wrapping up. So the last word is, you are a man who has had a very complicated, long career and certain regrets, but you're a happy guy, Ron, and that's why you're still with us at age 90, because you have a good outlook and you're not dwelling on failures.
And I happen to believe that I have led a charmed life. So many coincidences happened that put me in the position of the right place at the right time with the right skills to be a part of a magnificent enterprise without anybody knowing that it was ever going to be the largest corporation in the world. And I owe that, obviously, to Jobs and Wozniak. They were magnificent in their efforts to accomplish this.
And we'll just add that Woz has been very kind to you in recent years.
Oh, yes, very. He and Janet, his wife, very kind to me.
Steve Jobs would have been, I don't know, he wouldn't have been mean to you in later years. Maybe you never reconnected with him. Possibly not. All right, it's a wrap.
All right, thank you, Dan Kottke and Ron Wayne. This special treat for everybody. Thank you very much for coming up. Thank you. And thank you, Dan, for interviewing him. All right. Our next talk is going to start pretty quickly. Richard Reel is going to talk about aided programming, so sit tight. We're just going to get him set up here. If you guys want, you can go out to the table there. You can take questions of people. They're going to go out right outside. There's a little table there. Thank you. Thank you very much.